Hello and welcome to the North Coast Journal Preview. This is a show where we take a look at what's coming to this week's edition of the North Coast Journal. I am your host, Tanya Schrum, and we are joined, as usual, by North Coast Journal's news editor, Thad Greenson, and arts and features editor, Jennifer Fumiko Cahill. Welcome to you both. It's an action-packed week here in Humboldt County.
It is.
Aren't they all?
That's true. That's true. If you're ever bored, you're not looking around. Well, Thad, let's dive right in and let us know what's coming to this week's cover story for the North Coast Journal.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. This week we ran a Cal Matter story on the cover looking at potential impacts in California of a Supreme Court case that's being heard, or was heard on Monday, oral arguments, and decision is expected in June. And the case actually has its roots pretty close to home here on Humboldt. It's out of Grants Pass, Oregon, and what the case is really revisiting the rules set by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in a case, Martin versus Boise, which is kind of the precedent-setting case on what kind of the limits of local jurisdictions, local government's ability to criminalize homelessness or criminalize some of the impacts of homelessness. And so we were interested in it, and we don't generally, run statewide or national stories, but the interest for us was that this Boise, Martin versus Boise is really the case law that all of our local governments have set their homeless policies based on. Some of them, very, very mindfully, and some of them figuring out like kind of what's the most stringent and the most strident they can be in cracking down on homelessness without risking liability. And so basically what Martin versus Boise determined is that, or ruled is that kind of criminalizing sleeping in public places or camping in public places constitutes cruel and unusual punishment if you don't give folks an alternative. So for cities that have, a plethora of open shelter beds, Martin versus Boise, kind of the Boise ruling, allows them to be really strident in issuing citations or jailing people for sleeping in public or camping in public because there isn't a viable alternative for them. Or, it allows cities to kind of make certain areas of the city allowable for camping and sleeping outside, but really prohibit it in others. But what it says that cities can't do is just have blanket prohibitions where we don't have available shelter beds and we're still going to arrest you or cite you for camping in public. And so folks who, might remember that when the city of Eureka cleared the Palco Marsh a handful of years ago, there was a last-minute lawsuit, and that's what it was charging, is that these folks didn't have a viable alternative place to be. And folks also remember the city scrambled to put together a shelter with a nonprofit Betty Chin Center and some donations to kind of come up with enough beds that they could argue in court that they had places for folks to go. So what's happening now is that the city of Grants Pass passed a series of laws that effectively prohibit sleeping with a blanket or sleeping materials on any public property in town. And so back in 2018, a group of homeless residents sued the city, have won a couple of court hearings in their favor, which the city has repeatedly appealed. And now that case was heard before the U.S. Supreme Court on Monday. So we have a story looking just kind of at that story, Johnson versus Grants Pass, and then we have a story that I did kind of talking to local officials about what might change if the Boise precedent is overturned. And it was interesting that, not surprisingly, there's a variety of different viewpoints. So I caught up with Miles Slattery from the city of Eureka, who said, basically like they're really trying to take a humanitarian, compassionate approach and really bolster their programs, their number of shelter beds, and those things, figuring that there will be, a natural movement into those programs once those programs, have a track record of being successful and are large enough to kind of accept everybody. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, I talked to Merritt Perry, the city manager down in Fortuna, and he said basically that, I mean, the city of Fortuna does have an ordinance that prohibits camping and sleeping in any public spaces in the city, and they haven't really been able to enforce it. They passed an ordinance that kind of knew was unenforceable under Boise, and he's kind of said, yeah, I think as a city, we would really like to enforce our ordinance, and he's concerned with kind of cracking down on some of the, the negative impacts of homeless encampments as far as trash accumulation in creeks and environmental degradation and those types of things. Interestingly, he said, we realized that doing that and enforcing our ordinance isn't really going to cause, correct or cure the root causes of homelessness, which he identified as a lack of affordable housing, addiction, and mental health issues. But so, kind of how this case plays out, I would agree with Merritt that it's not going to do anything to address the root causes of homelessness or change the homeless epidemic that we're facing, but it does give cities additional leeway to address it in certain ways. I think there's a different municipalities prefer kind of a carrot or a stick approach, and this certainly, if Boise is overturned, will give them the ability to carry a much bigger stick in trying to criminalize certain behaviors and push people away from doing them. Interestingly, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, asked, I think pretty pointedly to the attorney representing Grants Pass, so you jail somebody for sleeping in public, like how does that change their situation? They're going to be out of jail in 30 days, and does that do anything to kind of make them more likely to find a place to live? The obvious answer is no. But
it's definitely a complex issue, and I mean, in my opinion, criminalizing is obviously not the way to go, but it definitely needs someone to be proactive and come up with better solutions for all three of those aspects, as far as mental health, addiction, and the lack of affordability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think there's a plethora of research at this point that that points to the fact that things like homeless encampment sweeps and these types of ordinances don't really do anything to move the needle in the long run and aren't cost effective for local governments in the long run. I think the big challenge is that the approaches like housing first that are have kind of borne out under the research to be successful do take a significant initial capital investment, and it's hard for even a city like Eureka that has kind of pledged a housing first model. It's difficult for them to implement it kind of instantly with just because of that upfront investment.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that reporting, Thad. Do you have any final thoughts before we move on to the breaking news of the community?
No, just as I said, the Supreme Court's decision is expected in June, and certainly if they overturn Boise, I would imagine that there's going to be a lot of city councils locally and maybe the Board of Supervisors revisiting their anti-camping or anti-sleeping in public ordinances.
All right. Well, thank you. Let us switch to what's going on around town.
Yeah, what the ongoing news story or the continuing to develop news story is that a building, Siemens Hall on the Cal Poly Humboldt campus, has been occupied by a group of, sounds like, as many as 50 or 60 protesters. And they entered the building Monday afternoon. This is a group trying to bring awareness to the Israel-Hamas war, and specifically the plight of Palestinians in the war-torn region and the humanitarian crisis there. And so they, like I said, occupied the building, came with sleeping bags and tents in some cases, seemingly intent on staying a while. And initially on Monday night, there was a very tense standoff with police. It sounds like there was as many as several dozen police officers from a variety of local agencies under the direction of the University Police Department, was the lead agency. But There was, definitely some pushing and shoving with protesters. There were reports that the police tried to arrest some protesters, only to have them pulled back by other protesters into the crowd. And it seemed like a very real possibility police were going to kind of storm the building and clear it by force. There's a request for pepper ball guns, which are kind of used for crowd control. Thankfully, it seems, cooler heads prevailed, and at least for the time being, the police just made the decision to stand down, and do what they could not to escalate that conflict, and kind of ceded the building to these protesters occupying it. So, as of Tuesday morning, all the entrances and exits to Siemens Hall were blocked off by piles of picnic benches and tables and office furniture, and there was kind of protesters manning those entrances and exits. Some students were dropping off supplies, food, and other things, kind of in solidarity with the protesters. And we, through a spokesperson, kind of got the list of demands from the protesters, and it really starts with they're asking the university to divest from all investments in arms companies, Israeli companies, or any other entities that might be profiting off the conflict in Gaza. We then went to the university to kind of ask about their investment policies, ask about their holdings, and have not gotten answers to those questions yet. But that's where things stand currently.
It's interesting, and I think that as a demand, how do you factor in our Cal Poly versus all Cal Polys in their investments? So that's kind of possibly a question I would ask the protesters if I were facing them.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I understand it, the CSU has, certainly has its own investment holdings as a group, but then there's also specific investment, portfolios held just by both by Cal Poly Humboldt and by its advancement arm, and its fundraising wing. And so I think it does get really, really complicated, and certainly, it's not as though all those holdings are just going to be stocks in individual companies. I'm sure they also, have interests in mutual funds and stuff that have investments across, portfolio of hundreds of companies. And so that gets really complicated really quickly.
And I am very happy to learn that cooler heads did prevail and that the police presence was de-escalated, because I also, I live in Arcata, and I did hear the helicopter, and before I saw the local news, I thought it was about the child that was swept away on the river, and all of a sudden everybody's talking about a protest. So it was pretty fascinating to start hearing about it through the community. So I really appreciate that you guys brought this reporting to this week's edition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wasn't personally on scene Monday night, but have spoke to a variety of people who were, and it does sound like it was, again, just very tense and pretty much on the brink of becoming violent. Whether, depending on who you ask, the fault of that lied with, police or with protesters, but it certainly seemed like there was a mutual escalation going on for at least for some time.
Well, I appreciate the reporting, and I know you will keep us up to date with information as it comes available.
Yeah, definitely, Tanya. The last thing I'll add is just the last we heard from the university is that campus will be closed through the end of the day today, Wednesday, and it's kind of unclear whether that means it'll reopen Thursday morning or there'll be another announcement from the university.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We are going to turn our attention to what's happening in the entertainment of the county.
Yeah, it's a big entertainment week for local things. And if you look at Colin Yo's set list this week, he does share some opinions because Colin is mouthy like that.
I appreciated that Colin put his opinion in the piece. Absolutely.
He always does. But he shared his thoughts about what was happening on campus, and in the world in general. And he does mention a couple of gigs that are on campus And so if you are planning on going to those, he makes a note that assuming Cal Poly Humboldt is still open to the public on Saturday, there is a Richmond, Virginia quintet, Butcher Brown, in the Kate Buchanan Hall, and he's a big fan of their jazz sounds. So hopefully they'll be able to perform. It seems really difficult to imagine stopping all of the in-person activity on campus, given that this might be prolonged. It sounds like, people are ready to stay camped out there. He's got a couple of different gigs to go around, but what I enjoy is that there's, for every visiting band, for every out of town touring group, there's usually like local support. So for the Butcher Brown show on Saturday in Kate Buchanan, he refers to it as downright filthy in its open romance with that magical era when heavy chops, emerging technology, and wild innovation created a heavy ambrosia of divine and funky sacral vinyl recordings. How am I supposed to summarize that? But the opening act for this group is Object Heavy. Hey, Object Heavy, how you doing? Frequent flyers on our Best of Humboldt list for Best Humboldt Band. Another band that Colin has a lot of love for, the California Honey Drops. They're a Bay Area busking band, apparently from way back. They are going to be at the ATL, and that's going to be on Sunday, which is nice because, Sunday show. But I am possibly most excited about Monday, the Metal Monday shows that Colin has been touting at the Savage Henry Comedy Club, because it's not all comedy. Sometimes it's metal. Are you ready for the names? I feel like we have this week's band name of the week.
Oh, I think we do.
Is it Insomnia Syndrome? Solid, but no. Brain Dead Rejects, they're frequent flyers in this column. I'm going to say that this week's band name of the week is Dumpster Puppies.
Love it.
Dumpster Puppies. He says, Dumpster Puppies is from Crescent City, a town so depressing that it must create some good bands on the back end of that deal.
Hey, I like Crescent City.
And he adds, hell, it's worked for Eureka. Oh, do you see the slap mark on my face?
That I was going to say. Oh, shots fired.
So listen, lots of towns with like depressed industry and whatnot. Some good music comes out of those places. It is the silver musical lining, I guess. I don't know. Look at us looking on the bright side.
It's that whole philosophy of, does art need suffering to prosper?
I find that life will provide you with enough suffering that you'll be okay. We don't need institutional suffering. So the next thing that I want to point out to you is, again, a combination of local and out-of-town vibes. John Bennett's movie reviews this week include a review of Abigail, a review of The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, little action movies there, and the locally filmed Sasquatch Sunset. Some of you may remember there were some sightings of some movie stars, Jesse Eisenberg among them, and Riley, how do I say it? Coe? I don't know how to say it.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure.
Riley Coe? She's probably not going to hear this. Sorry. Anyway, they filmed a movie up here, and everybody's like, oh, what was it going to be? And then some reviews started coming out from screenings, and the main thing about the reviews was, or at least the word from the screenings, was that people were walking out. Walking out because they were horrified by a lot of bodily functions. So let's look back at some Sasquatch movies, some Bigfoot movies. The Harry and the Hendersons, we got Rubber Suits, we got Family Fun, Willow Creek. Hey, shout out to Willow Creek.
Right.
Terrifying, and helmed by Bobcat Goldthwait. Didn't see that coming. We've had a lot of Bigfoot movies. In fact, one of these days I've got to get somebody to write the definitive guide to our Bigfoot movies. But this one involves the actors in suits, and according to John, no dialogue. Some grunting, some gestures, but no actual talking. Kind of like a nature documentary, but not, because they sometimes pan to other animals. There's all kinds of weirdness happening, but it's kind of like a family that's, traveling around surviving for a year. And so the film is super weird. Again, no dialogue, no real plot per se, besides them kind of navigating the pitfalls. There's no real arc happening. And he says there are some things that could be tragic, but it's so weird. And he says at one point, one could say a film like this has to exist sort of outside of the mainstream. But then he's like, but a film like this, can you really say that when there literally are no films like this?
Well, there's our 2024 bingo card, new genre, nature mockumentary.
I guess, but without any kind of voiceover saying, and this is where the Sasquatch family makes its home. Instead of Attenborough, we just kind of get the forest. And at the same time that he feels very hurt and disappointed because, as somebody who loves the big reclusive guy, he was like, they kind of come off like idiots, like the Keystone Sasquatch. But at the same time, he says it's, what did he say? It contains comedy and tragedy, and it is a fantastic movie in its way. He says it's surprisingly well executed, at least technically. And even though it lacks a storyline, it settles into a sumptuously shot, warts and all, nature film, quote unquote, narrative. And that it probably will be too much for a lot of people. And apparently he was reminded of some bodily fluids that he'd forgotten existed. Maybe have your popcorn first before you
and
go.
Have your Sasquatch spayed or neutered.
Absolutely. So important. And if it's cold out there, they're cold, right? If you're cold, they're cold. Let them inside.
Yeah, bring them on in.
But that's more or less what we've got. Of course, check out the calendar. Kali Koziris has combed the area to find you tons of things to do. But yeah, I am very curious to hear what local people have to say about Sasquatch Sunset. So if you go to see it, drop us a line. You'll see that there's a Filmland. There's a screens at northcoastjournal.com email address that you can send to. I would love to hear what people think about this movie and if maybe they recognize some of the locales.
Absolutely. And now I'm intrigued, so I might have to make time and make popcorn.
Yeah, eat it first.
Eat it first. Hey, I'm in medicine. Nothing's gonna.
Nothing scares you. Not even dumpster puppies?
Dumpster puppies, they make the best rescues.
That's true.
That's gonna be your faithful co-pilot after a good cleanup and a trip to the veterinarian.
Dumpster puppies is going to be like the new Garbage Patch Kid. I would 100% buy the dumpster puppy stuffed animal and accompanying baseball card.
But we had that in the 80s. There were pound puppies, if you recall.
I know, but they were so perfect.
I was going to say pound puppies meet Garbage Pail Kids.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about puppies with an edge.
I think that's the $1 million idea right there.
Puppies that have lived. Seen things. But please go and check out the set list because there's plenty to do around the county, and hopefully those shows on campus will still be on.
Yes, definitely check ahead if you have any shows that you're attending at Cal Poly Humboldt this weekend. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Thad. That wraps up our time for this week. The current edition of the North Coast Journal is available on newsstands now, or of course you can find it online at northcoastjournal.com. I am Tanya Schrum. Thanks for being with us and staying informed and supportive of our North Coast community. Have a great week.